So imagine you have an Isekai series. Standard formulation. Harem, main character was unduly blessed with insane levels of power, and a powerful and poorly named demon is the cornerstone of the plot. Okay, so now that you have the generic Isekai plot in mind, there are a handful of tweaks you need to make. First, add a severe case of self-aware Chunibyo to the main character, so that he's convinced the plot is all just make-believe even though he lives it. Next, make him very narrow-minded and focused, so he doesn't have a care in the world, especially not for women. He has a harem, but doesn't really care about the benefits or any of the girls who take interest in him. And with that, you've basically arrived at what we call the Eminence in Shadow. I'm not gonna lie, this show is pretty much generic trash isekai number 843. But it still somehow manages to grab your attention for the few minor tweaks it makes to the formula that have a lot bigger impact on the overall show than you'd think. And while a lot of the things about this show are covered in the usual isekai stink, Sid Kagano, the main character and the biggest redeeming quality of this show, is a really great feature for this show. In fact, Sid is like 80% of the reason why I watched this show. I won't lie to you, the animation is very middle of the road. The story feels shallow, and the characters are hard to find any reason to give a damn about. Still though, its innovations are unique enough to give it a different experience than most of the standard isekai formulations you get. And it's still something you can enjoy, albeit for a singular gag. So what exactly is the Eminence Shadow about? Watch just about any other isekai and you basically understand the plot. Sid Kagano, formerly Minoru Kagano, is reincarnated into a fantasy world of dragons, elves, magic, and demons. In his first life, Sid had a real bad case of Chunibyo. He trained endlessly to develop his skills as a vigilante. He beats up gangsters and kidnappers with crowbars and the likes, all while pretending to be a total nobody in his actual public life. But in saving his classmate Akane Nishino, who gets way too much attention in the opening not to be incredibly integral to the show, Sid realizes that his abilities can only take him so far. He's powerless against multiple trained opponents, and especially against weapons of a higher caliber than a blade. So he makes the only logical decision a man in his position can make, and bashes his head against a rock before booking a date with Truck-kun. In death, Sid finds the answers he was looking for. He's reborn into a fantasy world as a powerful magic user. Now granted the godly power that rivals the might of nuclear weapons that he desired in his first life, Sid sets out to live out his great fantasy, being the leader of a powerful and shadowy organization. Basically, this guy is the ultimate Batman wannabe. He resumes his vigilante actions in this new life, and along the way he finds girls who are made victims of a strange curse. After he cures the first girl's curse, he describes to her the supposed reason for her position. He spins some strange tale about how she's the descendant of the great hero, and that a group called the Cult of Diablos has experimented on her and cursed her. Of course, he's pulling all of this out his ass, and is up to his neck in his own bullshit by the end of it. But the world around him seems to have some strange sense of irony, as he perfectly describes the situation just as it is. This one little incident leads him to being convinced that nothing that happens in the plot is actually real. And it becomes a theme for him to blunder his way to success. So it turns out that there really is a Cult of Diablos. The girls actually did carry the blood of the hero, and there really was such a monster as the demon Diablos. And with Sid taking the Ainzul Gon path of just smooth-braining your way to victory, things get really, really interesting. Again, he's totally convinced that his own secret organization, Shadow Garden, is just humoring his delusion, and that the cult is fake and Diablos is a myth. Still, he plays along because he enjoys it, and Shadow Garden manages to get Sid involved in major instances repeatedly, which he enjoys because he's a bit of a battle freak. Effectively, we can sum this up as Sid manages to meander his way into a bunch of big instances, absolutely body someone, and then waltz away like nothing big happened. Rinse and repeat. All the while Alpha is actually doing all the exposition and world building. He makes an enemy out of entire kingdoms, taunts them for the fact that they can do nothing in the face of his power, and then just goes back to being an average Joe. Shadow Garden, or the cult, starts some shit. Sid bodies someone in a fight, and then everything goes back to normal until the cycle is ready to repeat again. Now, I actually find the world of the Eminence and Shadow very interesting. And that was what initially drew me in. But this first season doesn't really offer much in terms of expanding on anything other than Sid's ridiculous level of power. The world building doesn't really get into any juicy details. It only really gives you the basic understanding of everything that's going on. The developments that involve Shadow Garden and the Cult of Diablos are somewhat minimal, and they don't carry much weight in the plot outside of the events of the Sanctuary arc. The first arc establishes the extent of the corruption of society, and the idea that there is this group called the Knights of Rounds within the Cult of Diablos. Interesting, but we don't really get any deeper information outside of the idea that they live very long lives. And because a lot of the characters aren't that attractive narratively, the story feels boring and detached. Eminence and Shadow ends up being a very events-driven story, where things happen and the plot is based on the things rather than the characters. And this sense of detached feeling is a result of the fact that the plot is driven by things happening rather than characters doing things. The second arc in the story establishes the concept of falsified history and deep deception running through society. It also establishes the idea of Diablos having a lingering conscious will, and it having memories and such, as well as multiple fragments scattered across the world. And the final arc serves as a testament to the power of Shadow, and to set up the alignment dynamics of all the characters that were introduced to the series thus far, as well as adding a few tiny and almost irrelevant bits of information that pertain to the world abroad. My big complaint about the Eminence and Shadow is that Sid is effectively handed every event to deal with by his subordinates in Shadow Garden. He really doesn't do much to accelerate the plot himself, other than fight the final battle. And as the main character, he doesn't really put in much work. And now, I will be fair in saying that that's just a natural consequence of the structure of the story, but it makes Sid feel entirely detached from the things that are happening in the plot. And because he feels so uninvolved in his own story, it leaves me with this sense of dissonance in the narrative structure. Again, Sid is convinced that none of it is real and that his friends in Shadow Garden are just humoring his delusions. So he rarely goes out of his way to do anything other than to pretend to be some below average Dark Knight. Oddly enough though, that's the aspect of the story that I actually find fairly entertaining. Sid is an overpowered character done well. Interest in him isn't derived from his struggle or the times he overcomes impossible odds, or even in character development, much like Saitama. Interest in him is derived entirely from who he is, and the moments where he uses his unrivaled power. He is effectively a cult of personality, and the only big moments he gets are the moments where he uses his unrivaled power. He's all but guaranteed victory the moment he decides to flex on someone, due to the sheer magnitude of his power, so you don't get to connect with him through the struggles because he never undergoes them. Instead, the interest is derived entirely from Sid's pre-existing personality and quirks. And the self-aware, delusional young man's tendency to pretend he's not the most powerful person around provides a very fascinating take on his character type. He still maintains some of the very stereotypical isekai protagonist aura, and the fact that he's so good at everything he touches and never really has to change. Which makes his character weaker than other types because it ends up being a bit of a one-trick pony. Back to Sid's existing quirks that make him more fun to watch than most isekai protagonists. Sid is very meticulous about engineering his entire image, both as Shadow and as Sid Kagano. While he makes Sid Kagano a very underwhelming, skittish, and pathetically unskilled knight, Shadow is enigmatic, sophisticated, and overwhelmingly powerful. It adds a little bit of fun duality to his character, and it leads to some very entertaining events. And it's rather clear that he's still ignorant, mostly by not really caring to understand. And he ends up getting himself wrapped up in some strange relationships outside of Shadow Garden. His gift of chocolates to Sherry is interpreted as a confession of love. His fake confession to Alexia goes from a convenient relationship for the princess to her one-sided love. And his act of trying to play the role of a background character during the attack on Midgar Academy earns him another admirer because Rose yet again interprets his action as love. It's a little funny because this dude has absolutely no interest in women, but seems to accidentally attract a harem. He's a natural chick magnet and doesn't even seem to care. In fact, he seems inconvenienced by them more often than not. Oh, and let's not forget the Brocon older sister he tries to avoid either. Sid revels in being the background character under his born identity, while also being the powerful and enigmatic shadow that strikes fear into the hearts of those who stand against him. This simple little twist made an otherwise boring and trite isekai trope one of the more interesting facets of the show. And again, the large number of characters means there isn't much time to expand on them a ton, outside of Sid himself. But since Sid really isn't that much of a dynamic character to begin with, that's a little unfortunate. Still, it's wrong to say that there aren't some intriguing members of the cast that I have my eye on, just in case they come around. Alexia was interesting, and I mean that in the fact that she could potentially be a good character. She's pretty much average in just about every way you could interpret that statement, but that offers her room to grow on you if she's given the right treatment. And her entire character structure is a bit mediocre overall, as is Rose, but the different paths they take means we could see two very different characters coming from similar positions. But outside of that, most of the characters in this show feel shallow or underdeveloped. I didn't find a character who particularly wowed me, so it made it hard to care about anything that was actually happening and largely resulted in the whole show feeling like it only had a shallow appeal of watching whatever antics Sid got up to. Now, it's very much a trash isekai, harem trope, overpowered main character, and mid-level writing, but it's still fun to watch. The animation isn't the worst I've seen, but it's still only middle of the road. It's nowhere near Chainsaw Man or Demon Slayer when it comes to fight scenes, but it's certainly not an Arifureta or Demon Lord retry. And while I honestly did enjoy watching this show, I can't ignore the objective flaws. I will give it this: if we had a contest to determine the king of bad to mediocre isekais, it would end in a victory for the Eminence and Shadow. In spite of the whole thing still feeling very shallow, I still think this show is an A-tier isekai. For what it's worth, it's still fun to watch so long as you go into it expecting the typical isekai experience. I would give it like a solid 7.2 out of 10. Enjoyable, but not the kind of watch again fun that a good show will give you. The most satisfying moments are when Sid displays his unparalleled power to humiliate his opponents. Other than that, the show doesn't truly offer much. You really are just watching this show for Sid. Now, I could be totally wrong here, and all of my opinions could just get absolutely blown up, because Season 2 has been announced, and I do plan on watching that. This one at least intrigues me enough in the story to see where it's going. So I won't be going as far as to say that there isn't a story. It's just that it's kind of secondary to Sid himself in the entirety of this show. But hey, that's all my thoughts. If you disagree, you are welcome to say so in the comments. I might argue with you, but I do appreciate the input. Anyway, like, subscribe, all of that stuff, and have a great rest of your week. Later.